We have another presentation by Dr. Serge García on examples of potential fishery OECMs. Thank you very much, Serge.
I realized when I start this that I have not introduced myself in any of the talks we have been through. So just want to say that I am part of the Fisheries Expert Group of IUCN after having worked for 30 years for FAO as director of the Fishery Management Division of FAO. Sorry, I need the... I want also to apologize because 2 days ago I didn't know I had to make a presentation like this one, so I had but 1 day to put this together. It's too long, so I will try to be very short anyway. But my purpose here is only to show, I was asked to present something about case studies, and at some point in the discussion I heard that I should talk about best practices and things like that. So first I said that it will be 5 or 10 years before we have best practices on OECMs, because on fishery OECMs, because for the moment we are just talking about whether we can nominate some, so we have no data on best practice. There's just some good understanding of the practice of identifying them, but not about managing them and measuring their efficiency, etc. And second, the only case studies that we'll be talking about will be the exercises in which more or less participated to test. It was essentially testing with experts and also with managers and also with people from communities, just test whether the criteria that CBD had adopted could be used usefully to identify an OECM. So none of what I'm going to talk about refers to areas that have not everything, or only a little of what I'm going to mention has led to declaring OECMs. It was more a debate about how do you do that and how you move towards declaring them. So I will just show you very rapidly some examples. And this is, for instance, Canada. Canada has already listed quite a lot of OECMs, and they have undertaken a fairly comprehensive process at national level to identify these areas. Many of these areas touch on fisheries one way or another, but most of them are really, for primary objective is conservation, very often of deep sea resources. I'm not going to talk about the NEAFC area because we had a full debate on that, but this is one of the areas that were considered early. I'm not sure if this is the one, is not the one on which you have made decisions yet. No. Okay, so it's still there. It was interesting as a case study because it's a complex area. It has 3 jurisdictions, UK, EU, and high seas. It contains MPAs in it, etc. So it's a typical, it could be a very typical fishery closed area with very complex consequences that could be examined as a potential fishery OECM. That area in the North Atlantic as well was examined because it's interesting because it's a protection of an area that protects the feeding resources of the seabirds in that area, but it also contains some MPAs, and it's part of a fishing ground. So it's an area that typically one would consider as a potential candidate to be an OECM. The corner-rise seamount is a typical set of seamount with deep sea resources, important, very important biodiversity values. In some cases, some of these areas might be MPAs or not already, I don't really know. This sponge reef, also in Canada, in the NAFO area, shows a very complex interaction between fishing zones and protected zones around very important NAFO, very important sponge reefs. So typically a fishing area that could be considered for OECMs. This ground has been also examined. It's typical in the sense that it's a very small closure that contains an absolutely unique species that has to be absolutely protected, and therefore it's in the middle of areas which are fished, so it could be threatened. And I'm not sure what Canada is doing, but I think protection is progressing already rapidly for that area. In summary, the conclusions we had, I have to stand there. The conclusions we had, you have the criteria there, A, B1, B2, B3 are the CBD criteria. In green, these are the criteria for the different areas. The criteria were available, the information was available, and the criteria were considered to be met. In yellow, you have the areas for which it was considered that either the criteria were not available or were not clear, and the expert could not conclude. So, but for many of the OECM criteria, the necessary information was available and the criteria were met. And the interesting point is that none of the areas that had been selected by the working group was found to be rejected. They all found areas that could be improved or could be, on which the information could be improved. Now, just for the areas that have been declared, the Philippines have declared a very large number of sites as OECMs, not fishery OECMs, but OECMs. Many of them are coastal, and many of them have small-scale fisheries in them or around them. And it's not always clear whether those areas are or not already MPAs. Morocco has declared also some areas as OECMs, and again, mostly they are terrestrial, but some are coastal and probably involve small-scale fisheries as well. They are strongly associated with MPAs. They are very closely associated to the MPAs in terms of spatial distribution, and we have seen that in many examples. In some examples, for instance, OECMs were identified around MPAs, like if they were working as a buffer area for the MPA, which is an interesting type of interaction between an MPA and an OECM. Oh, sorry. Why is it gone? Okay. South Africa also has identified a number of OECMs, most of them terrestrial, but there are some of them which are coastal. And it's not very clear whether fisheries are involved in those OECMs or not. The priority objectives are not reported. I mean, I'm not going into the details because the presentation will be available and you can have a look. But in many cases, you will see that the information provided is not sufficient to really figure out whether those OECMs are real ones. You just don't know. They have been submitted by the state, and you have to assume that they have gone through the objective, but it's not always clear from the information submitted. For the GFCM area, that is interesting, and we had already some discussions about the area in brown, which is the prohibition of trawling below 1,000 meters. That was discussed by the working group, and whether that could be an OECM. It would be probably the most gigantic OECM on Earth, no? But the conclusion was that because there were international jurisdiction and national jurisdiction crossing over, and it was too complicated to really think about that area as an OECM. And it might be better to consider smaller parts of that, including national and international jurisdiction, as OECMs. And you have a number of other areas which are fisheries restricted areas that might be considered as OECM. But as far as I know for the moment, GFCM has only started to look at the Jabuka-Pomo pit in the Adriatic Sea as a potential OECMs. And I don't know at which stage they are in the examination of the candidacy for that area. Ah.
You have to grab it the other way. That's it.
Okay.
Only forward and backwards.
Forward. Thank you. Just very briefly about area-based management tools that have been considered in the wider Caribbean as potential fishery OECMs through various operations in Puerto Rico, USA, Mexico, Costa Rica, Brazil, etc. A number of areas have been looked at, and I will go very, very rapidly to some of these, only to show to you the diversity of things that have been examined. For instance, this seasonal closures for a grouper in the area, it was considered. And there is this debate on seasonal closures is interesting because originally it was thought in the OECM debate that something that was seasonal could not be considered as a long-term conservation measure. So it could not be an OECM. But But my point was, well, if the impact on biodiversity is important, why not? But I would agree that a seasonal area could not be an OECM. But the World Commission on MPAs itself has opened that question by saying that if a seasonal measure was applied for many, many, many years or decades, and you could show that it had a biodiversity impact, then it could be considered. I think the reason was for bird areas, which in the ocean are closed only for a short period of time. But the idea was, if you close that area for 45 years, and you can show that you had a beautiful impact, positive impact, then it can be an OECM. So the question on whether or not a seasonal area can be an OECM remains open to demonstration. The Queen Conch area is a similar area, partly national, partly international, and it's well defined, it is delimited, it is managed, etc. So it could be considered as an OECM. The special fishery conservation areas in Jamaica. It was an interesting example of community-based management areas, which are managed by communities, which sometimes are considered MPAs formally, but sometimes are not. They contain a lot of fishing in there. It's not always clear whether they are MPAs or not, even when you discuss directly with them. But they are one of the examples of areas that might be considered as OECMs or as multiple-use MPAs. One of the two. The fishing refuges there are in many places of the world you have refuges, but these are in Mexico. And they are well established. Very often they are small, so you might consider the impact as perhaps too small. But when you see the string of these refuges on a very long coastline, then you start thinking that the whole stream might be a good OECM, even if each of them looks small. What they themselves say is that compared to MPA, these refuges are smaller and they are conceived as a network. They are usually established for a period of time. They are not permanent, but implicitly and historically, it is shown that they are renewed. The period keeps being renewed, so they end up working for a long time. They have low management cost and implementation cost because the communities are involved in the surveillance and implementation, and so on. Apparently, they have been shown to be effective. This is just another example of a much bigger refuge in Mexico. In Costa Rica, you also have community-based area called Marine Areas for Responsible Fisheries. So they are really fishery closures, but they have a lot of support from the community. They are delimited. I mean, basically, they meet the objectives. They meet the criteria. So if the states would like to nominate them, it could probably do that. An interesting series of things that we have heard already in this meeting is there's coastal closures to trawling, for instance, that can be extended for hundreds and hundreds of kilometers and represent really huge closed areas, which probably all have quite an important biodiversity impact. Colombia has registered officially a number of OECMs, and I'm not going to go through them, but you can see where they are. There's our MPAs in blues, and there's our OECMs. So you can see the close relation between MPAs and OECMs. You see here that the MPA is enclosed inside the potential OECM. This one, the OECMs are really coastal and probably not very important. A preliminary conclusion on the Caribbean examples are that the island states in the Caribbean have not made any proposal yet. They cover a range of ecological domains, inland, coastal, marine. They are very close to or surround MPAs, like buffer areas. They are part of existing conservation areas. They have important human settlements, and therefore there are important socioeconomic issues in those areas. The fisheries very often are implicit in those areas, but they are not well mentioned in the database, so you don't know exactly what role fisheries play. And the primary objective for those areas is usually conservation. By opposition, when you go to the Pacific, many of those areas are in islands, and the main objective is not conservation, but livelihood conservation. A tentative conclusion on the global picture is that the OECM identification process is slowly taking off. Examples in the marine area are still very few. The countries seem to have chosen to identify OECMs across the entire territory, because we always discuss the possibility for a state to take a pilot example and work from there, or to do the whole country as a whole. And apparently, the approach chosen was to take a comprehensive approach to OECMs. The authorities were Fishery or Ocean Biodiversity Agency in Canada, but also sometimes agencies in charge of environment and development, like in the Philippines, Morocco, and Colombia. So the leading agency could be either from the fisheries or for the environmental side. The way the identification criteria have been applied when you look at the database, is not very clear. The primary objective stated may be conservation or not in all of those areas. And in fact, the other economic sectors than fisheries have been invited by the CBD to contribute, but I haven't seen much development coming from other sectors. Thank you. I'm sorry if I can. I wanted to add a few things that I noted after having done that, because I didn't have much time. Many of these areas, I think, are being considered now as potential OECMs by the states concerned. As you have seen, the number of the types of fishery closures that could be considered is very high, there are many types of fishery closures that can be considered. One thing we noted in all these working groups, and I'm referring also to the debate we are having here, is that you have many questions that look very complicated to deal with when you are dealing with the questions in a very generic way. In general, it looks very complicated. But when you are sitting with 15 experts around one area, it's very easy to respond. All of those questions can be very easily responded, and very few remain in the dark. So what I mean is that we tend to overestimate the complexity when we keep discussing in a generic framework compared to discussing case by case an area, sitting with the experts in a given area. In general, we found that it was not difficult. When you look at the areas one by one, it's not difficult to decide whether or not it is a good potential candidate or it is not. It was rather easy to do. One thing that you can also see when you go through all this exercise is that the fishery closures which have conservation as primary objective are the easiest candidate, of course, because they are already genetically, they're already prepared for that. One point was also clear is that having experts that know very well the area you are discussing, when you are discussing case by case, of course, is fundamental. And the second fundamental thing is that you need to have the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Fisheries working together. And we have seen good examples where when this collaboration was really intense and effective, it was very easy to go through the identification. A few final comments were that the OECMs which are already listed in the WCMC database, it's very hard to figure out their real performance. They are there, but you have very little data. And probably it's too early. And one can only assume that the data will accumulate, and finally we might be able to see how effective they are. One point on industrial fisheries that Darius mentioned. We have seen in many discussions a sort of restriction, no, to industrial fisheries. And first, of course, the first point is, if the area has industrial fisheries, look at the criteria and just do the assessment. And if they have a negative impact, okay, the area is not an OECM. It's very simple. But in fact, I think that there is something that has been missed, is that if it might be logical, or it might seem logical to say, I don't want to have industrial fisheries in an OECM because of its conservation objectives, there is no reason why you should not have OECMs in an industrial fishing ground. In fact, it's the opposite. If you have an industrial fishing ground, probably you should have OECMs in that fishing ground. So people tend to confuse an OECM in a fishery with a fishery inside an OECM. And if you don't keep that clear in mind, you're going to confuse things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Serge, for your examples with regards to potential fishery OECMs. And since you mentioned the time frame for preparing this presentation, well, if you can produce such a detailed, high-level presentation within such a short period of time, there is no wonder why you are such a leading scientist and a true inspiration globally on this domain. So very grateful to have you on board. Thank you very much for joining us today. And well,